November 1964. Four men entered the Manistee National Forest on a Wednesday morning. By Saturday, only three of them would speak of what they found there. The fourth man, a mill worker from Cadillac, Michigan named Harold Joubert, did not say a single word about those 4 days for 30 years, not to his wife, not to his pastor, not to the county sheriff, who came to his house the following Monday asking questions about an abandoned campsite and 3 rifles left behind in the mud. 30 years of silence. Until the autumn of 1994, when Harold Joubert was dying of lung cancer in a hospital in Traverse City, and he called his eldest son to his bedside, and he told him everything. What he described does not fit easily into language. But we are going to try. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, accounts buried in county archives, whispered between old men, never meant for the public record, consider subscribing to this channel. Some of what we uncover here was deliberately forgotten. Now, back to 1964. To understand what happened in the Manistee, you first have to understand the men involved. Harold Joubert was 41 years old in the fall of 1964. He had worked the same sawmill outside Cadillac for 19 years. He was not, by any account, a man given to exaggeration. His son, Thomas Joubert, would later describe his father as the kind of man who didn't say much and meant everything he said. The second man was Dale Pierson, 38, a machine operator from Manton. Dale and Harold had been hunting together since they were teenagers. They knew each other the way men who spend long silences together tend to know each other, without needing to explain very much. The third man was a younger fellow named Roy Ackerman. He was 26, unmarried, a deer hunter since the age of 12. Harold had met him the previous season through a mutual acquaintance at a feed store in Cadillac. Roy was eager, talkative, the kind of young man who fills up quiet with words. The fourth man was Earl Davison, 44, a retired Army corporal who now ran a hardware store in Hersey. Earl had served in Korea and was, by every account, a composed and methodical person. He was the one who had scouted the campsite weeks in advance. He was the one who drew the map. These were not frightened men. These were not men who startled easily. They entered the Manistee National Forest on the morning of Wednesday, November 4th, 1964, with 2 trucks, 4 bolt-action rifles, a canvas wall tent, and enough supplies for a 5-day whitetail hunt. They never completed the 5 days. The Manistee National Forest in November is a particular kind of world. 600,000 acres of mixed hardwood and conifer, laced with creek drainages and logging roads that dead-end without warning. The canopy is mostly stripped by early November, but the cedars and pines keep their cover. And in the low places where the river-bottom willows grow, visibility drops to almost nothing. The light, even at noon, comes in flat and gray, filtered through cloud and bare branch. It is the kind of landscape that reminds you that the word forest once meant a place outside the law. Their camp was situated near the east bank of a small, unnamed creek, approximately 11 miles from the nearest paved road. Earl had chosen the location for its deer sign. Scrapes along the creek bank, rubs on the birch trees, tracks in the soft mud near the water. It was a good camp, a sensible camp. On the first day, everything was as it should be. Thomas Joubert recalled that his father described those first 2 days with something close to fondness, even decades later. They made camp on Wednesday afternoon. Earl had fashioned a fire ring from creek stones. Harold and Dale worked the ridgeline to the north, while Roy and Earl pushed the creek bottom below. By evening, they had seen 4 does, 1 small buck, and an 8-point they agreed to leave for the morning. The nights were cold, near freezing, Harold said, and the sky was clear enough to count stars through the tree gaps. They ate canned beans and the venison jerky Dale's wife had packed, and they talked about ordinary things, their children, the upcoming presidential election, whether the Lions had any chance of finishing the season respectably. Roy told a long and involved story about a bear encounter he'd had near Grayling 2 summers prior. Harold remembered thinking the story was probably somewhat embellished. He remembered thinking that he was glad to be there. Thursday morning brought frost on the tent canvas and a buck that nearly stepped into Roy's lap at first light. Roy missed the shot, high and to the left, and there was a good deal of good-natured torment about it over coffee. By Thursday afternoon, the 8-point had not reappeared, and the crows had gone quiet. Harold said he noticed the crows first. The morning had been full of them, their rattling calls, their constant presence in the high branches. By early afternoon, they were simply gone, all of them. The whole forest, Harold said, had taken on a quality of attention, as though it were listening. He mentioned it to Earl while they were still hunting along the creek bank. Earl looked at the empty canopy for a moment and said, "Weather coming? Maybe." But the sky was clear. The first sign they could not explain came Thursday evening, just before dark. They had returned to camp to find the camp in a state of mild disorder. Nothing dramatic. A canvas bag that had been hanging from a pine bough was on the ground, its contents scattered. A tin cup was knocked off the folding table, the kind of disturbance that might mean a raccoon or a camp-bold squirrel, except that the bag had been tied with a slip knot 7 feet off the ground. Roy said it was a bear. It was the obvious answer. Black bears in the Manistee were not unusual, but there were no claw marks on the tree, no scat nearby, none of the destructive, single-minded ransacking that a bear tends to leave behind. Whatever had visited the camp had not been interested in the food. The jerky was untouched. The bag of cornmeal was untouched. Only the bag that held the extra rope and Harold's compass had been disturbed. And even then, nothing was taken. Earl studied the ground around the camp for some time without speaking. Harold asked him what he was reading in the dirt. "Tracks," Earl said, "but not the right shape." He would not elaborate. Harold, who would replay that moment many times over the following decades, said he did not press Earl on it. He said he knew, in that way that men sometimes know things they cannot explain, that pressing Earl on it was not something he wanted to do. They ate supper early. They kept the fire high. In the night, Harold woke to the sound of something moving in the tree line to the north. He lay in his bedroll and listened. Oiks was not the sound of a deer moving through brush, the irregular snap and rustle of an animal that weighs 200 pounds and walks on 4 legs. This sound was different. It was deliberate. It was rhythmic in a way that suggested a measured, unhurried stride. And it paused as Harold lay there, at a distance he estimated at perhaps 40 yards. Then it was still. Harold did not leave the tent. He told his son, 30 years later, that he was not afraid in that moment. Not exactly. He was, he said, simply very certain that he did not want to use his flashlight. He lay awake until gray light came through the tent. In the morning, he found the tracks. They were in the mud along the creek bank, a line of them proceeding from the north tree line to within perhaps 25 yards of the tent before turning and returning the way they had come. They were roughly the shape of a large canine print, but larger than any dog or wolf Harold had ever seen, and pressed with a depth that suggested substantial weight. More troubling than the size was the stride. Harold had tracked game his entire adult life. He had seen the tracks of wolves, coyotes, dogs, deer, bear, and every smaller creature native to northern Michigan. These tracks were spaced in the pattern of something that had been walking upright. He showed Dale. Dale looked at them for a long time without speaking. "Should we tell the others?" Harold asked. Dale said, "Let's not ruin the hunt." Friday passed uneasily. The deer had moved. The ridgeline and creek bottom that had shown such promise on Wednesday were now empty. A silence that felt, Harold said, less like absence than like withdrawal, as if the animals had been evacuated. He and Dale worked a wide circuit through the timber and came back with nothing to report. Roy and Earl had a similar account. That afternoon, Earl found the remains of what appeared to have been a deer carcass on the slope above the creek. It was recent. The blood was not yet fully dried, but whatever had killed the animal had left it in a state that none of the four men found easy to describe afterward. It had not been fed upon in the way a predator feeds. It had been, Earl said flatly, taken apart. The word he apparently used, more than once, was deliberate. Roy wanted to leave that evening. He made the argument practically. The deer weren't moving. They'd burned the best days. They could come back in a week when conditions changed. Harold recognized, and later acknowledged, that Roy was not making a hunting argument. His voice was 3 degrees higher than its ordinary pitch. His hands moved too much when he talked. Earl said they were staying through Saturday, as planned. He said it in the tone of a man who had made a decision and did not expect to discuss it further. Harold agreed with him, though he could not have said exactly why. Dale said nothing. That night, Friday night, something came to the edge of the firelight. They all saw it. It was standing in the tree line, perhaps 60 yards off, a darkness within the darkness, taller than it should have been. Harold's first thought, and he repeated this to his son with some insistence, was that it was a man, a very tall man, standing at the tree line. He nearly called out to it. Then it turned its head. In the firelight, at 60 yards, in the dark of a November night, you cannot see clearly. Harold was honest about this. He said he could not tell you with certainty what he saw. What he could tell you was that the head that turned was not shaped correctly for a man. It was long in the wrong direction. It sat on the shoulders in the wrong way, and the eyes. When they caught the firelight, Harold paused here in his account. His son reported, for nearly a full minute before continuing. The eyes reflected the light the way an animal's eyes reflect light. Not the dull, flat reflection of human eyes, the bright, precise, liquid gleam of a predator in the dark. None of them moved. The fire crackled. The thing at the tree line was still. Then it stepped back into the timber and was gone. Roy Ackerman began to cry, not loudly, just a quiet, persistent weeping that he made no attempt to hide or explain. Earl Davison picked up his rifle, worked the bolt to confirm a round was chambered, and laid it across his knees. Dale looked at Harold. Harold looked at Dale. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Dale was the first one to see it clearly. This happened just before midnight on Friday, while the other 3 were inside the tent. Dale had insisted on keeping watch. He'd taken the first 2-hour rotation with his rifle and a hand lantern, posting himself at the south corner of the camp. When he came back into the tent an hour early, he did not say anything. He sat on his bedroll with the lantern in his lap and stared at the canvas wall opposite him until Harold asked him what had happened. Dale said it had come back. He said it had walked out of the creek, bottom, and crossed the open ground between the willows and the camp at a distance of perhaps 30 feet. He said he had the rifle up and his finger on the trigger, and he did not fire. And he could not explain why he did not fire except to say that something in him knew, with the same certainty that he had ever known anything, that firing the rifle would have been the wrong thing to do. He said it walked on 2 legs. He said it was tall, 6.5 feet, he thought, perhaps more. He said it had the head of a wolf. He said this plainly and simply, and then he said it again in case Harold had not understood him. "The head of a wolf," he said. "Not a dog, not a bear standing upright. A wolf's head on a man's body, on two legs, walking through the dark with a gait that was neither fully animal nor fully human, but something that existed in the uncomfortable distance between the two. He said it had stopped and looked at him. He said it had looked at him the way a thinking thing looks at another thinking thing. He said it had stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then it had turned and walked back toward the creek. Harold did not know what to say. He told his son that he believed Dale completely, not because the account was easy to believe, but because Dale Pierson was not a man who told stories. In 40 years of friendship, Harold had never known Dale to exaggerate, to embellish, or to say anything he did not mean with exactness. Earl listened to Dale's account without expression. When Dale finished, Earl said, "We'll be ready in the morning." Nobody asked what he meant by that. Nobody slept. It came back before morning. Harold believed it was around 3 o'clock when the tent began to shake. Not from wind. There was no wind. The shaking was rhythmic, a single, slow, deliberate impact against the tent pole at the southeast corner. Once. Pause. Once, as if something were leaning against it, or pressing it, testing the resistance of the structure. All 4 men were already awake. They had not spoken, but Harold could feel, in the particular stillness of the others in that dark, that no one had slept. When the shaking began, no one moved. The lantern was out. 4 rifles were in 4 pairs of hands. Roy made a small sound. Earl reached across in the dark and put a hand on Roy's arm, and Roy went quiet. The shaking stopped. Then, from just outside the tent, perhaps 4 feet from where Harold lay, came a sound. He spent a long time trying to describe it to his son and ultimately settled on this. It was a vocalization, not a howl. Nothing so simple as a howl, not a growl. It was a sound that resided, Harold said, in the place between those things. And it was made by a throat that was not built the way an animal's throat is built. There was an intonation in it that suggested control. That suggested, he said carefully, intention. It went on for perhaps 8 seconds. Harold said those 8 seconds were the longest of his life. When the sound stopped, there was a period of absolute silence. And then, this detail would recur in Harold's account repeatedly, with a kind of horrified precision. They heard footsteps, clear, individual, bipedal footsteps, moving from the south wall of the tent to the north wall of the tent, slowly, without hurry, and then around the north corner, and then east, toward the creek, growing fainter, and then nothing. They did not exit the tent until full daylight. The final encounter happened Saturday morning. Harold believed it was their punishment for not leaving sooner. They were breaking camp when it came out of the cedar stand to the north. It did not emerge from shadow. It walked out of the trees into the gray November light and stood in the open, perhaps 50 yards from where the 4 men were standing at the edge of the camp, in full view, as though it had decided that concealment was no longer necessary. Harold said, "I want you to understand that I am not going to embellish this. I am not going to make it more than it was. I am going to tell you what I saw, and I am going to tell it plainly." It stood on 2 legs. Its posture was upright. Its height Harold estimated at 6.5 to 7 feet. It was heavily built, not with the visible musculature of a bodybuilder, but with the dense, assembled power of a large predator, the kind of mass that comes from function rather than form. Its body was covered in dark hair, not fur precisely. Harold said it was between fur and hair, the way a wolf's coat reads as both at once, depending on the light. The color was dark brown or black, with a graying around the muzzle and the hands. Harold used the word hands and then paused, apparently, before going on. The head was unmistakably lupine, long muzzle, high-set ears, pointed, mobile. They moved, Harold said, as the creature regarded them, with the precise orientating of a dog's ears tracking sound. The jaw was heavy. The brow was set low over the eyes. The eyes were amber. Harold remembered the eyes. He said that they were the part that was hardest to think about, later, in the quiet of 30 years. Not because they were menacing, though they were, but because they were attentive. Because whatever was happening behind them was not the simple, reactive processing of an animal encountering a human. It was something older and more considered than that. It was, he said, assessment. It stood there for perhaps 20 seconds. None of the four men raised a rifle. Then it turned, turning first its head, then its whole body in that slow, deliberate way. And it walked back into the cedar stand, and the trees closed around it, and it was gone. Earl said, "Now we go." And they went. They left everything. The wall tent, the folding table, the cooking gear, 2 of the 4 rifles which Roy and Dale had set down during the final encounter, and apparently could not bring themselves to pick up again. They took the vehicles and the weapons they had in hand, and they drove. 11 miles of logging road without stopping, and did not speak, until they reached Blacktop. Harold told his son that he did not look in the rear-view mirror until they hit the paved road. He said he had been afraid, not that the thing would follow them. He had been afraid of what he might see if he looked back at the tree line. He never said whether he looked or not. They separated at a gas station in Cadillac. Roy drove north to his apartment. Earl drove east toward Hersey. Dale and Harold sat in the truck for a while without talking. Dale finally said, "We don't talk about this." Harold said, "No." They shook hands. That was the last time Harold ever discussed it. For 30 years. A Wexford County Sheriff's deputy drove out to the campsite on Monday morning, November 9th, following a report of an abandoned camp from a forestry worker. The deputy's report noted the presence of 2 rifles, camping equipment, and signs of an abruptly abandoned site. The report also noted, in a single unremarked sentence, the discovery of tracks of unusual size near the creek bank, consistent with, and here the deputy's language becomes interesting, a large bipedal animal. The report was filed. It was not followed up. Roy Ackerman moved to Ohio in 1967. He died in 1989 of a heart attack. His obituary made no mention of the Manistee. Earl Davison sold his hardware store in 1971 and retired to the Upper Peninsula, where he lived until 1988. His son told a researcher in 2002 that his father had occasionally spoken obliquely about something in the Manistee when pressed, but always redirected the conversation. He would not, the son said, take the family camping. He would not, the son said, enter dense forest after dark. He had not, the son said, been like that before 1964. Dale Pierson died in 1979, a decade before Harold finally spoke. He had never, to anyone's knowledge, said a word. Harold Joubert held his silence for 30 years. He held it through deer seasons and family gatherings and long winter nights and all the ordinary passages of a life. He carried it the way men sometimes carry the things that most disturb them. Not by forgetting, but by choosing deliberately, day after day, not to put it into words. In October of 1994, with lung cancer advancing and the end becoming unmistakable, he called his son Thomas to his hospital room in Traverse City. He spoke for 2 hours. Thomas Joubert recorded the account in longhand in a spiral notebook, which he kept for 8 years before eventually sharing portions of it with a researcher studying Michigan cryptid encounters. He was reluctant to go public, he said. He was aware of how it sounded, but he had made a promise to his father, not to keep it secret, but to ensure it was not lost. He didn't want people to think he'd gone soft, Thomas said. He wasn't a soft man, but he needed someone to know. What Harold said, near the end of their 2 hours together, was this. He had not been afraid of it in the way he was afraid of other things. He had been afraid of it in the way you are afraid of something you cannot put away. Something that, once seen, lives in a particular corner of the mind and does not leave. He said he had thought about it every single day for 30 years. He said he thought, in the end, that it had not wanted to hurt them. He said he thought it had simply wanted them to know it was there. Harold Joubert died 11 days later, on November 14, 1994, 30 years, almost to the day, after 4 men drove home from the Manistee National Forest in silence. The Manistee National Forest is still there, all 600,000 acres of it. The logging roads still dead-end without warning. The creek bottoms still fill with cedar shadow in the afternoon. The deer still move at dawn, when they move at all. In 2019, a deer hunter camping 7 miles north of where Harold Joubert's tent once stood reported to the Wexford County Sheriff's Department that something had circled his camp in the night, something large, something that walked on 2 legs. The report was filed. It was not followed up. Whatever stood at the edge of that firelight. In November of 1964, whatever looked at Dale Pierson from 30 feet away and decided, for reasons of its own, not to do what it could have done. It made no appearance on any registry. It left no specimen, no photograph, no body. It left only tracks in creek mud and the 30-year silence of a man who did not tell stories. The forest is old. The forest does not particularly care what we believe, and somewhere, in the dark between the cedars and the birch, on nights when the crows go quiet and the deer have moved, and the firelight doesn't reach quite as far as it should, something is still standing, at the tree line, still looking in.